Welcome to the 2023 Kinsman Bioethics Conference. My name is Prasanna Krishnasamy. I'm the Medical Director of Clinical Ethics at Legacy Health. So I want to thank Dr. Susan Toll and the Kinsman Planning Committee for this wonderful opportunity to co-chair this conference, and to Legacy Health to co-host this conference with OHSU. Special thanks to John Kinsman for the endowment he established to provide partial support for this conference, and the Kinsman Foundation for their support in underwriting this conference. And we want to thank the planning committee members and the volunteers without whom this conference wouldn't have been possible. So I'm going to read out the names. If you guys could stand up and wave, I would appreciate it. Krisa Gigon, Susan Hedlund, Maureen Kelly, Stephanie Lavier-Miller, Bess Sedlacek, and Tyler Tate. And the Kinsman volunteers, Samantha Burke, Kelsey Charlesworth, Christiana Henkel, Dave Hoyt. Yeah, special thanks to Dave. He did all the heavy lifting for the logistics and planning for this conference. Thank you, Dave. Any questions on logistics and planning, ask him. Vilma Kodait, Akash Mishra, Melanie Smith, and Safa Sohail. So I want to share a few words about how we came up with the theme of this conference. In 2021, the theme, as you may remember, it was Truth, Power, and Justice, Bioethics as a Voice for Health Equity. In 2022, it was Ethical Struggles During the Pandemic, Reflections and the Path Forward. As we were coming out of Omicron, we were trying to look ahead. In 2023, after many meetings and discussions, we decided to focus this conference on the common good, health equity, and the public domain, in which various important stakeholders need to engage to address important and critical issues that we face as a healthcare system and also as a society. We were inspired by this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King: "There is a strange illusion that time will solve problems. Time waits for no man. The time is always ripe to do right." He shared this when he visited in Seattle in 1961. Thank you, Tyler. I think you proposed this quote for the title. And coming from India, and knowing that Dr. King was at one point inspired by Dr. Gandhi, I wanted to share a quote from Gandhi. I'm going to read it in Hindi first. I'm going to try. It's not my mother tongue. "Aap aaj jo karte hai, us par bhavishya nirbhar karta hai." It translates to, the future depends on what you do today. That resonates close to what Dr. King said in 1961. With that, I want to introduce my co-chair, with whom I had the pleasure of working for more than 6 months, Dr. Tyler Tate from OHSU.
Thanks, Prasanna. It was such a delight to work with Prasanna and to get to know him, and we couldn't have asked for better co-chairs, I should say. So we were really lucky to have him with us. Just to echo what he said about Dr. King's legacy, you know, it's not super common that you see Martin Luther King and bioethics collapse together. But I'm really excited for some of his work to be the kind of frame for this conference. In particular, when Dr. King thought about social ethics, he recognized that you couldn't just talk about structures. You also had to talk about heart. You had to talk about the spiritual dimensions of what makes a human being, and you had to recognize what the impact of structures were on the individual's capacity to exist as an existential agent in the world. So We want to have a bioethics that gives us hope and that doesn't just focus on the same sets of questions over and over again. And I hope that that can sort of be the way that we think about this conference, and our keynote will be a delight to hear when we sort of think about the conference framed in those terms. So just a quick, this is the most riveting part of the conference where we go over details. It's also not my strong suit, so I'm glad I had Dave Hoyt to carry me through. So we have we are proceeding through 8 to 8:15, and now we're on to 8:15 to 8:30. I'm going to go minute by minute through the whole conference schedule. Just kidding. We will, today's Thursday, and we will have a whole set of awesome talks. What you all probably know from looking through the schedule is that this is the main conference room, and then we have breakout rooms that are located here, and out the door as well. And if you have questions about that, just grab one of us. Grab Dave. He will helpfully direct us. So plenary talks will be in this room, and then any of the other breakout sessions will be in these various rooms. Hopefully everyone's signed up for your particular breakout sessions. Please go to the breakout session that you signed up for. We've taken account of those, of what you signed up for in order to sort of allocate what room different speakers are going to be in. And then we'll come back tomorrow morning for a whole another set of awesome talks and breakout sessions. And the stuff that we've all been waiting for, so continuing CE credit. So we have physician credit, nursing credit, social work credit. Let me tell you, if anyone in here has not worked on CE credit, it is having someone like Dave is worth their weight in gold. Thank you, Dave, for helping us get everything put together. In order to receive CE credit, you have to attend, and you do that by signing in. And you do that then by doing an evaluation, which we have QR codes now, because it's 2023 and we are fancy. So hopefully that will all be straightforward. If you have any questions about that, again, ask one of our volunteers or ask Dave. Otherwise, if you're staying at Boulder Falls Inn, checkouts at 3, check-ins at 11, and I think I kind of mentioned everything else here. We have our breakout sessions. Let's try and be prompt. We packed in a lot for this conference for y'all, so we'll try and get to our various rooms as quickly as we can and start on time. There will be conference meals and snacks. Notably, we'll have lunch with gluten-free and vegan options, which is nice because then we won't just, you won't just be released into Lebanon and then hoping to find food and then come back. All right. So I think I got all the important stuff out of the way. And thank you guys for being here. This is our first conference in a long time, right? That's in person. It's my first in-person conference. I came to HSU in 2018 and missed the first one because I was on service. So this is my first in-person conference, and it just, it's such a rejuvenating joy to come together. I was listening to a talk, a podcast on the way driving down here that was essentially about chronic pain and the ways that actually isolation has radically increased chronic pain and also increased suicidality. Some places in the United States reported an 8,000 times increase in the number of calls to their suicide hotlines. And I thought, part of this is sort of like the unrecognized toll and scar of the pandemic is this sort of social isolation that takes serious, has serious impacts on our health. And so this is a healing moment as well. Oh, nice. It's the Ezra Klein show, and it's from like 3 months ago, and it's on the Chronic Pain Handbook, which was produced by a psychologist at UCSF. Check it out. I don't get any kickbacks from Ezra, but I wish I did. All right. Without any further ado, and I'll get your slides up before I start. I want to introduce our keynote speaker, who I am wildly excited that we have coming all the way from North Carolina. Dr. Patrick T. Smith, whose talk will be called Moving Toward a Beloved Community, Bioethics. Dr. Smith is an associate research professor of theological ethics and bioethics at Duke University and at Duke Divinity School. He also works with the School of Medicine at Duke, serving as the director of the bioethics programs for the Trent Center of Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, and is an associate professor in Population Health Sciences, Department of Health Sciences. He is on the board of directors for the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, serving as treasurer, and also is a board member of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors. In 2023, Professor Smith was elected to be a fellow in the Hastings Center. For those of you who don't know, that is one of, if not the biggest honor that you can receive in bioethics today, in America at least. And the Hastings Center's fellows are a select group of outstanding individuals whose work has informed scholarship and public understanding of complex ethical issues in health, healthcare, science, and technology. Professor Smith has also worked professionally for 8 years as the ethics coordinator for Angela Hospice Care Center in Livonia, Michigan. He did do that. During some of the time, he served on the Ethics Advisory Council for the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization and as a board member for the Hospice and Palliative Care Association of Michigan. He was also a member of the Boston Children's Hospital Ethics Committee. So he has a really diverse set of experiences and ability to speak all the way from sort of very practical to very theoretical, which is pretty awesome. He has served on the board of directors of organizations working for the common good and more equitable social arrangements, such as YW Boston, which aims to empower women and eliminate racism. He also contributed thought leadership while serving in Massachusetts by serving on the board of a community development corporation that supports local communities through building affordable housing, engaging in advocacy work, and providing education on housing practices, policies, and practices. And I'm also would like to say, luckily, we've become friends. And that's probably the, for me, one of the greatest benefits of getting him to come to this conference. So without any further ado, I'm going to pull up this slide deck, and let's welcome Dr. Smith to the podium.
Not just Facebook friends, right?
Yeah. The friendship started, several years ago when I started stalking him. But since then it's it's become real. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Wow. Well, thank you. Good morning. Oh, very good. I did not have to say that twice, right? As I often say, I come from a call and response tradition, so we certainly like to hear you talk back. It lets me know, makes me feel comfortable, lets me know that I am at home even when I'm away from home. But it is a tremendous pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this opportunity for several months now. Thank you so much for this invitation. For all of you here, I'm just looking at this room that's full, especially after coming off of a pandemic here. Thank you, Dr. Krishnasamy, for getting us started here with this introduction. Tyler, for the invitation to come here. My colleague, Susan, and a fellow Associate Bioethics Program Director member, and as we are in meetings and working with ASBH together, it's great to see you. Always appreciate that engagement. And to Dave Hoyt, right? So for his tireless patience with me, oftentimes trying to catch me is like trying to catch the wind, one of my friends said. But I really appreciate Dave and all the work into pulling all this together. So we appreciate you very, very, very much in that regard. So what I want to do this morning with the time that I have remaining is just kind of set up a framing for, I hope, will be fleshed out in some of the other sessions that people will be describing and discussing. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, a wide ranging of topics that will help make more concrete some of the kind of make more contextual some of the abstract ideas or theoretical framing that I'm trying to highlight for us in this plenary session here. With respect to my work in bioethics, I began by serving as the director of the ethics department for a hospice care center. At that time, I was struck by my encounters with healthcare that used medical technologies in a way that prolonged the process of dying, seemingly as an attempt to save the dying patient from dying itself. Though, of course, no one would say such a thing, my work in these clinical spaces prompted me to ask, what might it mean to uphold the dignity or value, some might say, of patients, their close loved ones, and the staff involved in their care? Now, whether we come at this from various philosophical or religious traditions or whatever orients our minds towards certain important topics, we need to think deeply and carefully about what does it mean to value life at the end of life. These are certainly important matters. As I started wrestling with these issues, and as I was working with groups and communities who were either poor or socially disenfranchised for various reasons, it became increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to talk about what it means to value life at the end of life for those who were in situations of disadvantage without asking the question, what does it mean to value life before the end of life? It is sobering to think about the alarming statistics around the claim that a significant indicator of health outcomes is based on zip codes. It is sobering to recognize that the deep health and healthcare disparities and increased incidence of mortality that exist between communities divided along racial and socioeconomic lines. It is sobering when we remind ourselves that behind these stark, impersonal statistics are very real people and very real communities to whom those of us working in these areas have very real responsibilities. And I'm grateful that so many of you in this room are working in these areas and doing this work. Now, I want to highlight a particular concept here. It's a Hebrew concept of shalom that has really captivated my moral imagination when I became acquainted with it many years ago now. I am convinced that what I'm trying to describe here can be captured by this concept of shalom, which is a multifaceted concept. It reflects a reality that is marked by the presence of physical, material, and spiritual well-being, personal integrity, justice with respect to human relationships, justice with respect to institutional and community life, justice with respect to the natural and the non-human animal world, and for those who are so inclined, justice with regard to some type of, whether it be divinity, outside of oneself, or notions of divinity that may be very personal in different respects. This concept really depicts, I think, a comprehensive moral vision to which those of us working in healthcare perhaps could aspire. Right? Put this out as an option for us, a moral vision that we may consider our gaze upon, and then just imagine what would our work look like in light of this moral vision. The word shalom sometimes is translated as peace, but this translation is a little limited. Now, it's not inaccurate, of course, but the understanding of what is entailed by it is often misunderstood. The term shalom has a very rich meaning, I would say, and the idea should not be equated in a reductionistic way merely with physical nonviolence, though most certainly the notion includes it, but the contrast should primarily be understood between shalom and notions of social injustice, okay? And this really includes political and economic dimensions, absolutely. Now, this vision of shalom is partly motivated and promoted by the idea of neighborly love, right? Probably an idea that we've heard somewhere in our history, regardless of whether or not we've grown up in religious communities or whatever the case may be. This notion of neighborly love, something that is an important idea. It is a love of neighbors for their own sake, okay? The way it's at least developed in certain political traditions. It seeks to uncover or identify the neighbor in people we meet, having a deep regard and concern for them and that which contributes to their well-being, okay? So in its fullest dimensions, it includes economic and environmental concerns. Now, it's interesting because the way we talk about love, and sometimes loose ways and very broad ways, which is okay, but the notion that I'm getting at here, and the way certainly King and other political theorists were using this, is thinking about love as a political virtue, right? And oftentimes that kind of language is lost in some of our discourse and our work because I think we have kind of thinned out the notion of love as a political virtue and the centrality of it in thinking about these notions. An important feature of love as a political virtue is its role in the creation and the preservation of community, especially in those areas where there previously was none, right? There are all kinds of ways you can preserve community if you already have it. But the question is, how can you generate and create community, perhaps in spaces, in areas where there is no community? Martin Luther King Jr. and others would call this coming together in different ways. These communities built on love as a political virtue, understood as a political virtue, reflecting this idea of shalom as a beloved community. Dr. King was a staunch proponent of this kind of love. He saw it clearly, as did so many others who came before him and after him, that there is a deep relationship between social inequality and negative health outcomes. Before his speech of the Medical Committee for Human Rights during a 1966 press conference, Dr. King stated, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. King's understanding of love, his commitment to the idea of a beloved community, and his work towards this goal was deeply informed by the ethical resources that reflect a notion of shalom that cause us to be responsible for each other. Now, King was pointing to an idea that is important to think about, and namely that idea is that it is important to think about health in ways that are broader than is often captured in the modern medical model alone. Okay? Now, doing so can help us identify what makes a health inequality, in fact, an injustice, and what makes health differences, in fact, disparities. It reminds us that we must give attention to the larger social, environmental, and political factors that have direct impact on flourishing life and well-being. Now, King was pointing to ideas that have been long presented and deeply embedded in many philosophical and religious traditions. I just want to take two examples drawn from a particularly Christian tradition, just because that's the one that I know a little bit better than many of the others. And it's just here to illustrate the point of a kind of a way of thinking that has been carried over in many ways that should inform the way we think about how we do life together. The first is from a North African bishop, Augustine of Hippo, and fleshing out what this notion of neighbor love looks like with regard to our larger political economy. Listen to these words. He writes, medicine here includes everything that either preserves or restores bodily health. It includes, therefore, not only what belongs to the art of medical people, properly so called, but also food and drink, clothing and shelter, and every means of covering and protection to guard our bodies against injuries and mishaps from without as well as from within. For hunger and thirst and cold and heat and all violence from without produce loss of that health, which is the point to be considered. So Augustine here, right, has this expansive notion of what medicine is all about, right? It's just like, hey, there's all these other things, these larger social conditions, things that support our well-being that is important for us to consider. The second example is a little bit longer quote, but it's interesting to me when I came across this. It's from a 20th century German theologian, actually a guy named Karl Barth. And it's interesting how he unpacks this and thinking about what our common life and what it means to respect the lives of others and how this relates to questions of health. Listen to these words here. I mean, just bear with me just for several lines here. He says, the basic question of the power to be a person, therefore, for real health and the associated question of its expression and exercise are questions which are not merely to be raised and answered individually, but in concert or together. They are social questions. Hygiene, sport, and medicine arrive too late and cannot be more than rather feeble palliatives if such general conditions as wages, standards of living, working hours, necessary breaks, and above all, housing are so ordered, or rather disordered, that instead of counteracting, they promote and perhaps even cause illness, and therefore the external impairing of the will for life and health. Respect for life in the form in which we now particularly envisage it necessarily includes responsibility for the standard of living conditions generally, and particularly by those to whom they do not constitute a personal problem because they personally need not suffer or fear any threat from this angle. He's talking about the advantaged here. Being able to enjoy at least the possibility of health and to take measures for its protection or recovery in view of their income, food, working hours, rest, and wider interests. So again, he's talking about there's a kind of notion that for those who are in these advantaged positions, that there is a responsibility on the part of them towards others who are not so advantaged. He goes on to say that we must see to it that the benefits of hygiene, sport, and medicine are made available for all, or at least as many as possible. It must mean that the general living conditions of all, or at least of as many as possible, are to be shaped in such a way that they make not just a negative but a positive preventative contribution to their health, as is the case already in varying degrees of the privileged. The will for health the will for health of the individual must therefore take also the form of the will to improve, raise, and perhaps radically transform the general living conditions of all people. If there is no other way, it must assume the form of the will for a new and quite different order of society, guaranteeing better living conditions for all, right? It's very strong language here by this person reflecting from certain resources. And then lastly here, he says, where some are necessarily ill, the others cannot with good conscience will to be well, nor can they really do it at all if they are not concerned about neighbors who are inevitably sick because of their social position. For sooner or later, the fact of this illness will in some way threaten them in spite of the measures which they take to isolate themselves and which may be temporarily and partially successful. When one person is ill, the whole of society is really ill in all its members. In the battle against sickness, the final human word cannot be isolation, but only fellowship, right? Interesting vision here. Very deep, in some ways very radical, and one that we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe it though, right? This deep kind of interconnectivity, this deep notion of interdependence, right? In terms of the way our social life is arranged and what that means for how we think about doing life together. Now, both of these, I think, thinkers from religious traditions highlight the importance of social conditions that are needed to promote health and well-being, such that when people have access to these various social determinants of health, they can flourish. When there are impediments of place, people are unable to flourish. And so to lean into this vision, I think perhaps healthcare and those who are doing this work can be committed to this notion of the dignity of people as persons in community, the notions of common good, and a kind of solidarity. And of course, attending to the economic and political power levers in pursuit of a kind of health justice. The notion of dignity, I think, strongly affirms that people matter morally despite their skin color, socioeconomic status, limitations, and vulnerabilities that come along with being, I would say, finite and embodied human beings. The way that I'm using the term here signifies that humans are to be valued for who they are as they are. In fact, how people are viewed and treated precisely in the face of their limitations, difficult circumstances, and vulnerability is one of the most powerful means of affirming their value. And I say this well aware of the controversy on the part of some people when we use the term in the world of bioethics and medical ethics, right? This term dignity is fraught and is charged in different ways, but nevertheless, I think it still gets at some kind of fundamental idea. And even if the word itself may be off-putting to some, there is a reason why we take pains to care for people in ways that we think aligns with certain norms and values, because people matter in a particular way. A commitment to human dignity, I would suggest, provides the impetus for a corresponding commitment to the common good. If human dignity concerns itself with the status of individual persons in society, the principle of the common good widens our focus to the status of the whole society. Social arrangements shaped by policies, laws, and practices matter with respect to promoting or stifling human flourishing. The common good, then, reflects the degree to which the social conditions enable individual members of a given society to flourish, okay? So working for the common good, then, means working with and for those who are disadvantaged, right, or the disenfranchised, however that's maybe understood in various ways. Moving towards this notion of a beloved community also requires a commitment to a robust notion of human solidarity. It is a notion which is a hallmark, I would say, of social ethics. Solidarity is a unity among people within a social organization to have a firm commitment to the common good of all people, especially to those on the margins. It is a realization that all inhabitants of this great world house, to pick up language from King, are now and will continue to be neighbors, brought into being largely as a result of the modern scientific and technological revolutions. Thus, this would require, on this way of framing things, for people to have obligations to work on behalf of one another. Solidarity is the realization that Martin Luther King Jr. admonished a half-century ago, that together we must learn to live as neighbors, or together we'll be forced to perish as fools. A commitment to solidarity requires both individual and communal introspection and action, okay? Individually, as one ethicist puts it, solidarity invites us to consider whether our own behaviors and mentalities demonstrate a concern with those on society's margins. Communally, solidarity challenges us to ask whether the social organizations of which we are a part strengthen the bonds of human friendship, especially the bonds between those with and those without sufficient resources. If our societies are not doing this well, then we must seek systemic changes as to how they might be improved in order to enable such relationships as a matter of justice. The kind of solidarity, I think, called for here, which requires introspection leading to action, is not merely about technique, okay? It is also about the kinds of persons in community we want to be. And this is what Dr. Tate was getting at in his introductory remarks in many respects. And this is the kind of social ethic, I think, that King was espousing to, if we're using this as a way of thinking in some ways, how we can move towards a beloved community bioethics here. And listen to these words that King writes to this particular point. He says, "We have allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there is not proportionate growth of the soul," he says, right? And soul, he just means character, right? It's not necessarily kind of like dualism or anthropological dualism or something of that sort. Our hope for creative living in this world house that we have inherited lies in our ability to reestablish the moral ends of our lives in personal character and social justice, right? So he wants to hold these things together. So we have to work for these external changes because the social conditions matter with regard to how we think about notions of health promotion, but we also have to do that and reflect on the kinds of persons in community that we want to be that can drive that moral vision of social justice that we have. And then he ends with these words. He says, "Without this spiritual and moral reawakening, we shall destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments." And so this deep work of character formation, right, or shaping our dispositions can perhaps help move us toward a beloved community bioethics. That is, if some kind of vision in these ends, to this end, is attractive to some of us here. And I emphasize the notion of moving towards here. And that becomes really, really important, this notion of moving towards a beloved community. There's a gentleman, a scholar at OHSU Public Health, Ryan Pettaway, who wrote an article a few years ago, a health affairs blog, and I came across this and was just so intrigued and blown away by what he says here. And the title of the essay is "Dreams of a Beloved Public Health, Confronting White Supremacy in Our Field." But I want to share with you just some words to help solidify something I think is really important that needs to really be said here regarding this notion of beloved community and love as a political virtue, because I think sometimes we have a tendency to think about this as kind of being Pollyannish or just, kind of pie in the sky, or this is easy, kind of let's hold hands and have a kumbaya moment, right? And everything will be fine and glorious as we skip along the, pasture with the flowers blowing in the wind, right? And the music playing nicely in the background, right? And those kinds of things, right? It would be wonderful, right, if that were the case. But unfortunately, there's work for us to do. And so these are his words, and listen to what he says here. He said, King spoke of a beloved community characterized not by a perfectly peaceful and equitable society in some distant future, but by love, compassion, and the pursuit of justice now. There's an enduring recognition of our connected humanity and our inextricably linked liberation from all forms of oppression and exclusion in this beloved community. Yet it's not an idealized world without conflict. It's an inescapably imperfect society wherein the roots of conflict are recognized and responded to, not necessarily resolved, with love and reconciliation on the path towards justice. Then he says this, much like health equity, the beloved community requires attention to political and economic power, not as ends, but as articulated by King as a means to do the work of justice. And it's the collective pursuit of justice that gets us to the proverbial mountaintop, but this mountaintop is not the top of the mountain. Rather, it's the love and mutuality expressed on the slopes of our many ascents. So he really emphasizes this notion of the journey. Now, Petway rightly points out that a vision of beloved community invariably involves conflict. And it also means that we need to have a deep resolve and deep commitments that will keep us moving forward towards this idea of a beloved community bioethics. Now, moving toward this beloved community, I think, would require us in broad strokes, right? And this is not to be prescriptive in the kind of more concrete sense, but these are just kind of some general ways of thinking that I'm hoping there'll be more discussion throughout this conference of what some of this could look like on the ground as I was looking at some of the titles that will be over the various sessions for this next day and a half here. So the first is, I think maybe we can begin to imagine together an expanded notion of what is necessary for health beyond that of modern medicine's understanding. Now, many of us are part of institutions, and rightfully so, and we need to use and leverage the resources in those institutions to do the work that we're doing, absolutely. And I think those mechanisms are in place, and they can be means for promoting beloved community, but also recognizing that we can't ask medicine to do too much, and we have to think about what it means for us to be part of a larger community in order to do this work well. Second, to think about and reform how the financial incentives and economic models of healthcare maybe resist or at least become an impediment to preventive care as an overall approach to health. And then lastly here, to seek to embody a commitment to solidarity in our broader political and social life beyond the confines of professional clinical health care. So again, this is the idea of what does it mean for us to be a good citizen here. Now, some of you may know about James Baldwin. He's a literary artist from a generation or two ago, a generation from maybe when I was born, which means the days are adding up. Yes, they are. So much has changed, right, since those blissful days of my youth, right? But at any rate, so James Baldwin, in this little essay, As Much Truth as We Can Bear, he writes these words, and I think this is interesting and apropos to kind of close out our time as we open up for a larger conversation of discussion here. He says, we are the generation that must throw everything into the endeavor to remake America into what we say we want it to be. Without this endeavor, we will perish. However immoral or subversive this may sound to some, we must always remember that morality, if it is to remain or become morality, must be perpetually examined, cracked, changed, made new. We must remember, however powerful the many who would rather forget, that life is the only touchstone and that life is dangerous, and that without the joyful acceptance of this danger, there can never be any safety for anyone ever, anywhere. And then he closes with these words near the end of that essay, those of you who've read it here. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so this is the challenge in many ways before us as we seek to move towards a beloved community. How do we face the challenges, right, that we're wrestling with? One that recognizes the deep divisions, the polarizations, the challenges, the barriers, the fact that, yes, people are divided, and that there are such things as some would say political enemies and those notions, right? But how do we do so? How do we move forward in light of all of that in such a way that we can still move towards a beloved community, recognizing that there's an inescapable network of mutuality, that the flourishing of some groups, whether we like it or not, is dependent upon the flourishing of others. And so hopefully we can be encouraged in some ways to think about what it may mean. What would it look like for us to move towards a beloved community bioethics? And I hope some of the conversation the next day and a half can help us think about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can sit. That's perfect. Well, I asked Dr. Smith to even not take up the full hour so we could have robust time for Q&A, which I think that Q&A is oftentimes where we sort of get to the best part of a conference anyway. So we have 30 minutes for Q&A. So I hope everyone is thinking what questions they want to ask. I will start. I have a question. So what I've read about King and some of his adversaries, one might say, but so essentially folks who were working for the same, working on the same sets of problems, like Black liberation, folks like Malcolm X, who said even something that was remarkable about Martin Luther King Jr. was that even when he vehemently disagreed with you, you walked away still feeling like he loved you. So he clearly had some way to approach conflict that was different than a lot of the times when I approach conflict. And I feel like, here at a conference on bioethics, many of us are clinical ethicists working in clinical ethics spaces or working in policy spaces, both of which are rife with conflict. And that was sort of one of the reasons I wanted us to think about the common good, which is to have better resources by the end of these 2 days to approach conflict. So I guess my question is, based on kind of channeling Martin Luther King or sort of just your own experiences in navigating conflict at the either clinical ethics level, where you're actually one-on-one, face-to-face with someone, or more there's more space where it's maybe someone on Twitter or someone that you're working in policy that there seems to be a lot of conflict. How can you actually do that? Approach someone in loving kindness, embodying agape love, and not sort of lose yourself or create an enemy in the process? That's a massive question, of course, but I think in some ways it gets back to your noting that the major critique of this kind of approach will be that it's overly Pollyanna, that it's great to say but impossible to perform. So if you could just say, maybe unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, very good. Let me actually just, I think, stand here just so I can see.
And then we actually have mics, so if folks want to start standing up as they formulate a question or have one, they can stand behind the mics, then we can sort of just go from there.
Great, thanks, Tyler. It's just helpful that way I can see this side of the room a little bit. So, okay, Tyler asked this question, right, that is impossible to answer, right? And I give something and everybody's like, well, you didn't talk about this or you talk about that, right? So he set me up, but that's okay, right? That's what I guess friends do for you, right? But let me just make one point, right off the bat. So he mentioned about the whole social media thing, and so my kids absolutely tease me. I'm not on social media, right? And people have to actually tell me what's going on social media if anything is mentioned. So I probably won't speak to that part of things. I'll let others of you who have wrestled with this maybe chime in that regard. I want this to certainly be a conversation because I know that we all have different experiences in this regard. But no, your question is a serious one and an important one. So let me just start with, since we kind of invoked King, and here I want to say two things about this kind of what some would call the Kingian tradition. First of all, I think it's really important that we recognize that with somebody like King, that we have to think with King, against King, and through King, right? Because individuals don't always get everything right at any given moment, right, as we know. Also, I think it's important for us to see King not as King, right, in this tradition, but King as part of something bigger than himself, right? So King stands as part of a larger tradition, right? of Black intellectual and spiritual thought. And it's very clear in terms of when you look at his history, his academic background, his intellectual development, and even his work, that played itself out in some remarkable and important ways. And so in that sense, in trying to understand much of what King was trying to advocate at any given moment, one also has to be aware, right, of this larger tradition that King stands a part of, such that even if we disagree with various aspects of his words or thoughts, there's still a larger kind of body of material that informs this notion. And more to your point, right, this notion of enemies and conflict and those kinds of things. So King recognized, I mean, if any of you who have read, any of his writings or heard some of his speeches, he was under no false illusions as to the depth of the conflict, right? And, the use his terms like the evil that was being precipitated. And of course, he was part of this kind of religious tradition that wanted to embrace love. And it was this love of all across the board, and this notion of love of enemy. And so one of the things that he would often say is like, how do we generate community where there previously is none, right? Especially when there's these deep divides. And so he would have this turn of phrase sometimes, he was a preacher, right? So he had to have a nice, little, cool turn of phrase or something, right? He says when we're trying to deal with questions of enemies, right, we have to be careful not to try to remove the enemies, but remove the enmity that creates the enemies, right? So he says, what is it that is standing between groups and peoples and potential communities that is creating this enmity such that we can't either come together, or even if we're not best friends or anything like that, right? At least we can just learn to live together, to tolerate one another so that we can all flourish. And so for King, he always wanted to try to, as much as he could, distinguish or distill. He didn't want to lose sight of people, right, as individuals, but then also these larger kind of ideologies that drive the way we think about things. And so this is where he, as a kind of a political philosopher, political thinker, was always trying to get at what are the ideas that are driving these problems, but always keep face of the humanity of folks. So there's this notion of persons in community that I used here. It also comes out of a particular philosophical school of thought, kind of personalism, but that language is really important, persons in community, this kind of hyphenated language, because it's supposed to hold together the fact that, yes, there are individuals and persons matter in their individuality, but yet persons cannot be rightly detached from larger communities. And there's also another layer, right? This notion of person, there's a Greek word that often, I think it's prosopon, right? That talks about this notion of person, but really what that means is to turn to the face of another. Now think about that. We think about persons, kind of these individual persons, but this notion of person is to turn towards the face of another, right? And so I think for King, he embraced that, right? And so he had to keep that in front and center, and he was deeply criticized for it, but then he would often ask, can you tell me of any other way, right, that we can move towards this beloved community in a way that we don't end up ultimately killing one another. So in terms of the conflict, so I'm not a conflict management specialist, right, in this regard. And when I was doing ethics consults, when we would deal with these conflicts, one of the things that we would really try to do, which you all know here, and many of you are in a much better position to kind of answer this part of the question, I think, than I am. But I think we really have to begin to listen very carefully to one another when we turn our face towards one another to see what it is that is really going on. What I've often found is that when people are getting in proximity of one another, that some of those conflicts can be highlighted and we can get a deeper sense of clarity as to what is really going on and actually find creative pathways forward, as opposed to when we're much further apart in engagement with one another. The reality is that moving towards a beloved community, as Petway said, right? And I think as this tradition would tell us, that we will falter if we think we can do this work without conflict. The challenges that are facing us are too real and too deep, have a long history, and we're not going to be able to move forward unless it's actually confronted. And so the tension is what can give rise to the resolution. If the tension is not highlighted, then ultimately the resolution will not come. And so I think we just have to figure out ways to move forward, but this is why I tried to highlight these different kind of values from social ethics to say, what would things look like if we embrace this, right? If we often thought to say, let's not lose track of the humanity of others, how would that affect how we engage and navigate these notions of conflict here? And the very last thing I'll say, because I do want to move on to some other questions here, even though I know I didn't hit every aspect of your really important question, Tyler, is that, you mentioned terms like Malcolm X and King, and people still felt like like King loved them. And I would say perhaps, right? I mean, it's interesting. I know that, and I do get the true thrust and sense of your comment there. But I do think that sometimes 50, 60 years away from certain events, there's a tendency and temptation to be, well, let me put it this way. I think we have to be careful that we don't romanticize, right, kind of what was going on, what was happening there. King at the time of his death was at, very low popularity ratings, and many people have tried to kind of contrast Black nationalist, Black power movements from kind of King's notion of civil rights, and it was actually much more complex, I would suggest, such that it's hard to really appreciate what was going on in terms of those struggles without recognizing that facets of all of those movements become really important, right? So without kind of Black nationalist movements, I don't think King would have had the traction that he had, and some of the Black nationalist movements led by Malcolm X and so many others without this kind of other tradition. I think it would not have been as effective in many ways. And even Malcolm X would say it as well. He said, well, yeah, we need King because when they hear my ideas, right, then they'll certainly want to go with some of what King is proposing as opposed to what I'm proposing, right? So setting up that contrast there. So anyway, yes, ma'am.
I remember hearing about some research on military leadership documents, instruction over time, and they found that the word love appeared early on in instructing leaders towards leading the soldiers, feeling love towards their soldiers. But over time, the word love was edited out of that instruction. And if you ask me off the top of my head, I would say probably the word love does not appear in the mission statement of my organization. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on moving towards a beloved community without that kind of specific language, being incorporated into things like mission statements.
Oh, wow, very, very interesting. Can I get your name? I'm sorry.
Allegra Johnson.
Allegra, great. Thank you, Allegra, for that question. Yeah, some of my friends who are military, though they don't talk about this, but they do talk about the kind of professionalism, right, and some of the values that are inculcated and really kind of driven down deep that, permeates everything. And so it becomes really important. So there's no beloved community and love showing up in that space. I wasn't familiar with that genealogical history of the concept of love and leadership in the military. But in terms of our mission statements, yeah, it is fascinating, right? Because if something like this vision, or if one wants to pick up the language of beloved community, right, if that's what someone wants to do, then it would seem to me, right, that love understood as a rigorous political virtue, right, not in this kind of bland sentimentality, right, notion, right, because I think that's part of the challenge that that language, the word has been so watered down that it's really hard to grapple with and grasp and appreciate, right, the kind of deeper meaning of what, and the kind of work that this does for us. So I think if that can be retrieved in some way, and if the kind of vision that one is moving towards while recognizing that you may not ever, fully get there, again, to keep us from being naive, right, in terms of what's going on, then something like this language may need to show up, because when you think about your mission statements and these value statements, that's what puts these things on the radar screen for you. So then you're always matching how are your policies, your outcomes, and all these things mapping up against what you say you believe as an organization or as an institution and what you're trying to do. So I do think that if one explicitly wants to leverage this kind of language, right, moral vision, then some accounting of it, perhaps, right, would need to be there. Others perhaps would want to gesture towards the idea, right, in different ways. It may find other language to do it. And I think that's what any organization, right, will have to wrestle with and think about and how they flesh some of these things out. But I do think it's really important to tie one's mission with the kind of integral values and ideas and ideals that should shape the common work together in some ways. So thank you, Allegra. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi there, Kevin Dirksen, Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. Brilliant opening plenary lecture. I think it sets the tone for the 2 days that we're going to spend together, and offered some conceptual touchstones, at least to me, to think what this move toward a beloved community bioethics might look like. In that, I think you're doing a little bit of a play, if I'm understanding correctly, on when we turn towards something and to adopt a kind of conversion language, we're always also turning from something as well. And so that might mean that we don't have a beloved community bioethics today. Just wondering if you and others would agree with that. If so, and in terms of the call and response tradition, to offer you a moment for a kind of fire and brimstone moment of the talk, what are the places that we don't have a beloved community bioethics today? And I'd invite you to even think about some of those structures that we may inhabit in healthcare settings around the practice of ethics consultations, ethics committees, the promulgation of ethics education, in terms of what opportunities are we utilized to point toward that road to justice, that a focus on love, a focus on responsibility, and on a common good bioethics might beckon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for the brilliant framing, I think, of your question and what you were kind of picking up. And I mean, there's, with some of these words and these concepts, I mean, I sometimes am embarrassed by doing things in such short order for those who are very well acquainted and aware of these resources. Like, dude, but you didn't talk about X, Y, and Z, or this kind of counter perspective. Like, yeah, I know, right? I tell my students, it's like, well, you can't do everything in a paper, so don't try, right? But acknowledge, right, where there are some gaps here. And so, Kevin, I think you're right. I mean, there is this notion of the kind of conversion language, I think, is really big for me, right? And now let me tell you why. Not in terms of some type of religious conversion or anything like that, not necessarily, right? But it's more so of this turning away from, and when I think about certain movements that have taken place historically, or when I read historians or social historians who kind of recount some of these issues that happen, or kind of a weird convergence of events, that is not, I'm still recovering from my analytic, moral, philosophical training, right, in some ways, and recognizing that it is not always kind of good, sharp, crisp reasons or arguments that persuade and change the minds and kind of generate the kinds of turning away that we need, that is certainly part of it, an important part of it, but we need more, right? We replace bad stories with better stories, right? We utilize and leverage the arts, right, and artists in ways that are non-exploitative to kind of trouble the waters, to help us begin to see a new way or a different way of looking at the world. And so there's this kind of maybe a culmination or building up of things such that we can turn, right? And we never know when that moment comes, right? It could be triggered by many different things here. And so I do think that there is a sense of kind of taking off of one lens of glasses and putting on something else, right? One that says, how do we begin to center other things, and how do we begin to see what perhaps we have not seen up to this point, especially when we are not proximate in a different way. And so when you say we don't have a beloved community, let me just put it this way, right? And this is where I think, Petway makes this point in his essay, but so many others as well, that when we think about notions of justice and health equity, while we do have a vision that we maybe aspire to, I think we have to look at it as an asymptote, right? That we should be striving to get closer and closer and closer to the line, while recognizing we may not ever get to the line, right? Because what I'm concerned about is that we get very myopic, right, in our view, and I see certain kinds of things. It's like, oh, well, we have arrived, right? We have achieved health equity, right? Such that there are things that no longer need to be in place. And if it were that easy, that would be wonderful. But I don't think that reflects the way the world is. And so let me just say kind of one area here that I think where we don't have the marks of beloved community or beloved community bioethics in the way that we should, but I'm hoping that we can continue to push in this area. I would just say it's this intersection of, I mean, there's so many different ways one can line this up, right? I mean, there's the kind of rural-urban, right, divide, the way that we, sometimes our bioethics focus on some of these urban areas and city areas, but we forget about what's going on in rural populations and the social marginalization and disadvantages that mark and plague many of those communities. My colleague, Brett McCarty's been doing some wonderful work in those areas, and many of you in this room. There are also questions of socioeconomic status, right, in other respects, and I think that's really important. I would say what brings some of this together, at least the socioeconomic status piece, and of course, questions of gender, right, as well, the unique dynamics of the intersection. But I would just say the way that the racialized imagination is still at work in our larger body politic. Therefore, I think healthcare, at least in the United States, being a microcosm of the larger society in which it's placed, also bears the marks of a racialized imagination. And that racialized imagination, I want to say, entails not only like kind of questions of, you know, this broader notion of systemic and cultural or institutional racism, but also there's, I think, an intersection of questions of gender that we need to attend to, and certainly a kind of economic exploitative dimension that was part of what it means for us to become racialized, right? And what's fascinating to me is when we think about the notion of race, I understand it as a kind of a social construct, something that maybe appears to be natural, but really is the invention of a particular society. And the question is why, right? The genealogy of the concept. Why did this concept of race need to be invented in many respects? And really it was a justification mechanism to say, how is it that we can treat entire groups of people in certain kinds of ways, right? And then, of course, religion was used to marshal this. Science was used to marshal this. All of this was data to help inform policy, right, and politics. And that has permeated our entire life together. And so philosophers like to sometimes quip, right? If something is everywhere, then it's nowhere, right? Well, if it's everywhere, then it's really nowhere, right? Okay, however true that quip may be in certain settings, I think when we think about this notion of racialization and the deep harms that it has and how it's permeated various practices, I don't think it's quite that kind of quip applies with regard to this. And so what I often try to do is to encourage my students when we're talking about this, or other professionals, to say, can we think through any area of our public, private, or civic life that has been untouched by a racialized imagination, right? Law, policy, religion, transportation, education, sports, media, law enforcement, healthcare. I mean, just go down the list, right? And so we just try to sit, and we take several minutes to really talk about it. It's like, let's see if we can name one, right? So there's a larger socialization process that has taken place, and that has impacted medical education. It has impacted medical practice. And so one of the things that, and I get into it, I have to take it on the chin with some of my colleagues and friends who are doing this kind of work, because I emphasize this larger socialization process and recognize, like, look, this is just part of the air that we breathe, and a lot of times it may not be directly, like, intentional, like somebody just really being, you know, malicious in some way. And, you know, I was saying, well, you know, we can't let people off the hook. Well, of course, we still have to exercise responsibility, but this is the world that we have inherited, right? And so having said that, I do think that we see traces of that. So last night we were at a conversation, several colleagues, we were talking about the 2016 pain study, right, where medical residents and some of the medical students, the Hoffman essay that some of you have perhaps read, where people thought that black people's bodies were different such that they feel pain differently than white people, and that led to, they showed some correlation between that and under-prescribing or under-treating pain and some of the pain disparities and so on and so forth, right? All these different kinds of things continue to permeate, right? The practice of medicine, clinical care, the way biases are at work, structural issues in terms of how our larger communities are arranged. So I do think one area where we're not as close as we need to be to a beloved community, bioethics, is the way the racialized imagination with all the other intersectionalities that permeate the way we think about and perform our practice. I am grateful that there has been more attention given to those issues over the last few years. Some good work over at this conference, I think. I'm hoping we'll highlight some of that. Thinking about Dr. Russell, I'm not sure if she's in here now, but anyway, yeah, Dr. Russell's work, I think, will exemplify some of that as well later today, matter of fact, this afternoon. So, Kevin, maybe I should stop there because I know there are others there, but thank you so much for your question. Yes, ma'am.
Molly Osborne, I'm at Oregon Health and Science University in the VA. My question is simple. I'll give 2 reasons that I'm asking,
Okay.
and it's what keeps me up at night. So how to build trust is the question.
Yeah.
Simple question, no answer, I know that. The 2 reasons I bring it up are, in the role of ethics, has certainly come to be talking to people outside my territory who have said, political figures, for example, ethics is evil. Or the second particular concern I have is that outside my territory, which is a healthcare system, 2 healthcare systems, it's become very clear in the last few years, should have known it many decades ago, that we're not trusted particularly at all by many groups who I would like to build trust with, but they look at me, okay, I'm a short woman, I admit it, and I have an MD, PhD, which is even worse, by the way. And so I ask how to build trust. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And sorry, the first reason you asked, I think you said, was it the ethics issue?
There's a political figure in Oregon who we were having a discussion, of course we wanted to build trust, and just flat out said ethics is evil.
Oh, okay. Yeah, gotcha. Fair enough. Yeah. So yes. So so how to build trust? Ethics is evil. Yeah. Period. One thing that right. Let me see. I was about to use a different analogy, but I forgot that, as my buddies would say, Patrick, you're not at home yet. Don't use that one, right? So use another one. So I'll use another one, right, and not the bathroom one, right? But I know it wasn't bad bathroom humor, so don't tell my mom, right, that I was, doing something inappropriate in a professional setting like that, right? But no, so, it's this idea of many of us have driver's licenses and we can operate motor vehicles without kind of understanding and while at the same time not being an auto mechanic, right, or an automotive engineer, right, knowing exactly how it works, but yet we know, or at least all the mechanisms that go into how it works, but yet we can utilize a car. And I think that when we're working with communities, that ethics is something that maybe should drive us, or kind of the way we think about it, that should form and shape the way we engage others, the way we engage people, the way we engage communities, without necessarily having to kind of highlight or put forward, hey, this is kind of what we're doing. So in other words, it goes back to this notion of talking about what ethics is and then demonstrating, right, how we engage in ethics in some ways. And I would actually advocate for the latter, given working with certain communities. And you're right, so there's going to be this kind of deep trust where healthcare professionals are not trusted. And this is a deep problem. I was just part of a larger conversation. It was a kind of a special issue with people wrestling with the erosion of trust, and how are we going to even think about reclaiming this. And one of the things I took away from that national conversation is like, oh man, we're in trouble, right? I mean, I was just looking at, some of this and listening to some of the clips, right? I was just thinking, it's like, this is like pretty deep, right? And so there are challenges. So I think what for me, I think trust is going to have to be rebuilt over time. It's going to take all hands on deck, so to speak. And also, I think it's going to require that we begin to expand the type of resource that we bring into these spaces. So one of the things I would advocate is a greater inclusion of the arts and artists with regard to medicine. And the reason why I say that, because when you look at the early notions of, the pandemic, right? I mean, it was fascinating to me how artists in particular communities were mobilized so quickly, right? How they were engaging others, how they were bumping into questions of healthcare, sometimes troubling the water, saying maybe we shouldn't trust, but then other times trying to frame things in such a way to think about communities' well-being, right, in relationship to what was going on in the healthcare sector. But I would say that if one engages the arts and artists in a more robust way, that we need to think carefully about an ethics of engagement with artists, right, in ways that are non-exploitative. Don't romanticize the arts, obviously, and artists and their contribution, but also make sure that we understand that there's a value that's being brought to those various spaces, and find ways to compensate, right, for that work that is being done, because in a real way, I think they can be liaisons for the community that could be beneficial, right, and helpful. I also think that the credibility crisis that, as many of us as professionals are working with, we just have to be steady in doing our work. So over time, people begin to watch and see, and trust is something that has to be earned, right? So once it's lost, it is really hard to regain. But as I heard one political commentator say about something else, and I'll apply it to your question with regard to trust, is restoring trust, regaining trust, is going to be like running a marathon through mud, right? I mean, it's hard enough running a marathon, but then we have to run that marathon through mud, right? It's like, okay, it's just an added dimension. But if we think about the fact that beloved community bioethics, or whatever the case may be, our societies run on the oil of trust, right? Just think about that for a moment. When we don't have trust in our institutions, trust in our various communities, trust in one another, again, I'm not talking about any kind of Pollyannish vision or worry about some of this. I'm just saying, when we don't have that, I mean, just think about the grind that we find ourselves in. And so restoring this, I think, is just going to be people who are much smarter than I am, who have much more experience than I, figuring out collective ways that we can begin to engage once again. And I also think that not only talking about issues of restoring trust from somebody from the outside, like looking at us, but also I think that the real work that we're going to have to do, many of us in this space, is to show ourselves as being trustworthy, right? And I think that's where the emphasis really has to be. And part of the conversations I've been a part of nationally is just how do we begin to establish a kind of trustworthiness, get that in place, and not blame others if they don't see us as being trustworthy yet, because in many respects, there's reason to be distrustful, right, of many professionals, many spaces, and so on and so forth. So we just need a resilience, right? We need to kind of keep it going, keep it moving. Last thing I'll say, absolute last thing, when I was doing some work in the New England area, we were doing kind of community-facing work, and there was a group that was not fully taken account, they're not accounted for in some of the planning. And so, rightly so, there was a bit of a blowback, right? And some of the organizers of the event were like really disheartened and just felt like, oh, well, what, you know, we're trying, we're doing our best. And I said, you're missing the point here. I said, they're actually engaging us. And I said, what they want to do is to see if we're going to pass the smell test. Are we going to pass the smell test, right? So when you get a little bit of that heat, right, are you going to kind of tuck your tail and our tails and run and kind of get away? Or are we going to say, hey, you know what? We didn't account for that. We need to, that we will sit, listen, and learn from you, and we're just going to hang around, right? We're just going to hang around and show ourselves to be trustworthy in different ways. And so I do think a lot of dynamics are going on all at once. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you than that. But that's all I have. But there is a Hastings Center report that's coming out hopefully in the next several months. It's a special issue dealing with questions of reestablishing and reimagining trust. So please be looking out for that. And I think there will be some very interesting essays in that can give you some insight to what you're wrestling with. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have time for one more?
Yes, and I'll be very brief. I'll be very brief in my response.
There's an amazing book out right now that I've been reading by a rabbi named Rabbi Ruttenberg, and it's on repentance and repair, and it's about making amends in an unapologetic world.
Mm-hmm.
She looks at how Maimonides really codified the way we repent to others, and she breaks it down into chapters. And I've done pretty well with how we do that with individuals. I'm Jewish, I do this every year. Social worker, I've got that down. But the final chapter is how do we as institutions repent and repair. And the whole idea is when you go through this process, you're not expecting the person who is on the other end of that to necessarily forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
You're there to publicly say, hey, we screwed up,
Mm-hmm.
and we are truly here to say we're sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And when I work at OHSU, and I'm showing up in places, and I'm like, wow, we really need to repent and repair.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to do.
Mhm.
And there are way too many buckets involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get frustrated because I don't know that, and I'm not just OHSU, any healthcare system is truly
Yeah.
accountable.
Yeah.
So when we talk about being a beloved community, to me that involves repenting and repairing. And I'm just curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, let me say, and I'm glad I only have 2 minutes, right, because of the depth of your question that begins to show layers and levels of, in terms of being very specific here. So let me just say this, and I didn't talk about it here as much because I know it'll come up in one of the other presentations later today. that I think you can't, so for me, I think questions of social justice have to be informed, they have to be tradition specific, meaning whatever resources that you have that help inform the world, that whatever that content is goes into that, right? But then also it has to be particular, concrete, and in material expressions. So when we have abstract notions of justice, that can be, okay, it sounds really good, but the issue is how do you operationalize that, right? And that's always going to be contextual. It's going to be particular, right? And I also want to say that it has to contain a principle of redress, right? So I don't think you can have justice, especially social justice, without a principle of redress. And then more specifically, right, principles of redress, right? How do you right certain wrongs? That's when you get into questions of repair and what does that look like? And I think every health system, organization that understands its history, its complicity in these areas has to do that hard work internally, which requires leadership. It's going to require courage. It's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require doing a radical reordering of the way things have been, because the way things have been continues to perpetuate these cycles that lead to injustice. And so for me, you can't talk about justice without talking about a principle of redress. So the abstract pie in the sky principle always has to be seen on the ground, operationalized as a principle of redress in the form of repair and maybe even reparations, right, in some ways. And so, and that's where the idea for me, and I know I'm at my time, Tyler, here, right? The idea here is that it's a very simple notion, I think. As kids, we learn when we broke something, we say we're sorry and we try to fix it, right? So for me, the idea is very straightforward. The issue is, do we have the will to operationalize this in a larger body politic? So thank you all so much for your attention and your time. I really appreciate it.